He stood there in silence, surrounded by laughter that wasn't meant to be kind. A crowd dressed in luxury stared at him like he didn't belong, as if his presence had cracked the perfection of their world. The man's clothes were worn, his shoes dusty, but his eyes carried a weight none of them could understand. In front of him gleamed a blood-red Ferrari, its surface shining like a mirror of arrogance. And beside it stood the man who owned it, a millionaire grinning wide, daring him with words meant to humiliate. "If you can make it run, it's yours!" The crowd laughed harder, unaware that this wasn't just a challenge about a car. It was a challenge about worth, about dignity, about a lifetime of being judged before being known. Cameras came out, some filmed for fun. Others whispered, calling him names under their breath. He didn't react. He just looked at the car, then at the man mocking him, and for a moment, just a brief, uneasy second, the laughter around them began to fade. No one knew who he was. No one knew what he had been before the world labeled him nothing. What they didn't know was that beneath the dirt and silence was a story that could shatter their illusions of wealth, power, and pride. A story that would prove the real difference between them wasn't money, it was humanity. As the engine of humiliation roared louder, something else was about to ignite, because this wasn't just about starting a car. It was about starting a reckoning. And when the truth finally comes out, the question won't be, did he fix it? It'll be, who really needed fixing? This is where it all begins. He woke before sunrise like he always did. The city was still asleep, but for him, mornings weren't for rest. They were for survival. He washed his face with cold water from a cracked sink, buttoned the same worn shirt, and stepped into a world that rarely saw him as human. His name was Samuel. To most people, he was invisible. A janitor, a handyman, a face they passed without remembering. But to those who looked closer, there was something different about him. The way he handled tools with precision, how his eyes lingered thoughtfully on broken machines, how he fixed what others had already given up on. Once long ago, he'd been more than this. An engineer, a man who built things that changed lives. But life doesn't always reward talent, especially when the world sees your skin before your skill. Now he worked odd jobs around the city, cleaning, repairing, staying quiet. He had learned that silence was safer than truth. Still, deep down, he carried a quiet pride in doing things right, even when no one was watching. That morning, he was walking past the Grand Imperial Hotel, where a charity gala was unfolding. Bright lights, polished cars, and people who believed luxury proved worth. He didn't belong there, and he knew it. But fate, cruel and strange, doesn't ask for permission. As he walked by, he saw a crowd gathered around a bright red Ferrari that refused to start. The owner, a young millionaire, was surrounded by laughter and champagne. To them, it was a small inconvenience, a momentary glitch in their perfect night. But when Samuel paused, studying the car's faint whirring sound and flickering lights, the millionaire noticed him too, and that pause became an invitation for mockery. It was supposed to be just another night of work, another day blending into the background, but destiny had parked itself right in front of him, gleaming red, waiting to test not his skill, but the patience of a man who'd been underestimated his whole life. And as laughter echoed through the marble courtyard, Samuel took one slow step closer, unaware that this night would expose more than a broken engine. It would expose a broken truth about humanity itself. He felt the heat from the crowd before he felt the heat from the engine bay. It was the kind of heat that came from eyes, not from metal, eyes that judged, measured, and dismissed. The courtyard glowed with soft gold from chandeliers inside the hotel, but outside the light felt colder. The supercar's paint trapped every reflection like a mirror, and in that mirror he saw himself the way they saw him. Worn clothes, tired shoes, careful hands holding a rag that had seen too many years. A man who looked like a problem, standing next to a machine that looked like perfection. He stepped closer, not to the owner or the laughter, but to the car. It was the only honest thing here. Even broken, it spoke the truth in small signs, the soft click of relays with no confidence behind them, the brief flicker of the dashboard that died too fast, a tiny tremor somewhere under the fuse box. like a heartbeat smothered by a heavy hand. Samuel read these signs the way some people read faces. He had spent years listening to machines the world said he wasn't qualified to touch. He listened now. Behind him, the crowd tightened. The hotel's archway framed suits and silk gowns. Phones lifted like little spotlights, all pointed at a stage he hadn't asked to stand on. He felt the tug of old shame, the kind that teaches a person to step aside, to move on, to make space for those who were always allowed to stay. But the car haunted him. Something was simple here. Something was solvable. In a world that had turned him into a ghost, this machine still spoke a language he knew. He kept his head down and studied the edges, the battery posts too clean for a lifetime of real use, the immobilizer dome near the steering column, the way the windshield glass held a faint smear in a circular pattern where a suction cup had once clung, a hint of transport, a hint of interference. He had seen this before. Cars that were shipped, secured, locked by systems meant to prevent thieves, but which often punished owners. He had also seen the other kind of interference, the kind people did for attention, pranks dressed as power, tricks that were easy to play when a man like him was nearby to blame. Security edged closer. Their silence said more than words. He knew the script. He was not supposed to touch anything. He was not supposed to be here at all. But the owner's smug posture had created a permission that was also a trap. It was always like that. Permission until the moment he looked competent. Permission until competence threatened the order of things. He did not touch the paint. He did not lean on the body. He crouched near the front wheel where the air carried a faint chemical bite. Not fuel, something else. He followed it to a panel line and paused. On the other side of that panel lived a fuse array. He imagined a finger he hadn't seen pulling a specific fuse halfway out, not enough to be obvious, enough to turn arrogance into spectacle. The thought did not comfort him. It made his chest feel tight. Because if he fixed it fast, the crowd would cheer the wrong man, and if he fixed it slow, the crowd would blame the right one. He stood and wiped his hands on the rag. The laughter swelled and broke in little waves. He could feel how much they wanted a scene. He thought about walking away, and for a second he did. He took one step back, but the step hurt more than the eyes on him. It hurt like swallowing a truth that had lived too long in his throat. He turned back to the car and made a choice. If this became a stage, he would not perform for them. He would perform for the machine and for the quiet memory of the boy he once was. Curious, patient, sure. He scanned the ground. The valet station had a small toolbox. Security watched his eyes track toward it and shifted to block the line. He didn't argue. He had learned not to spend words where action would do. He checked his own pockets. A nickel, a bent safety pin, the old fob from a bus depot locker, the rag. He looked up at the car's side mirror and saw the crowd in reverse, elegant guests captured in a warped, laughing horizon. He looked down again at his hands and decided he had enough. He slipped the safety pin open and knelt near the fuse hatch. He did not open it yet. He traced the seam like a violinist testing a string. He slid the pin into the seam and felt for resistance. The panel lifted a whisper. Security took a half step forward, but the owner's pride kept them still. The panel came away slow. Beneath it, rows of colored fuses sat like a grid of small promises. He leaned in, eyes moving the way they had moved for decades over schematics and harness maps and boards with traces thin as hair. He didn't need a chart. He needed the story, and the story was there. One fuse rode higher than the rest by the width of a breath. He did not push it in. Not yet. He closed the panel softly and stood. The crowd murmured as if a punchline had been stolen. He walked to the rear quarter where the body line met the deck and stopped. The smell had deepened. He slid the rag along the seam and came up with a faint film, detailing spray, fresh, cover scent for hands that had done more than polish. The conclusion sharpened. This failure was not an accident. It was theater. His chest grew heavier. Because theater needed villains, and the easiest villain was already standing in front of them. He walked to the driver's door and studied the gap where the glass met the weather strip. There was a tiny nick, sectioned. A suction mount had been pulled there, too. Someone had lifted the glass to slip a wedge inside, then pulled back. Not a thief's mark, a bored man's mark. A man with time, money, and an audience he craved more than truth. His heart began to race, not from fear of the crowd, but from a fear he recognized inside himself. The fear of being right in a place that punished men like him for being right. He had learned that correctness often cost more than silence. He let the fear sit. He did not let it lead. The hotel manager appeared near the archway. Samuel did not look at him, but he felt the new shape of authority in the air. The manager spoke to security with the quiet urgency of someone protecting a brand. The owner embraced the attention, spreading his hands, drawing lines in the air that placed Samuel at the center of the story. Phones rose higher. The algorithm would enjoy this. Samuel heard a high-pitched electronic whine when the door was lifted, a noise that didn't belong to mechanical failure. It belonged to an immobilizer that had been armed and disguised. He knew the pattern. When a certain fuse hung just loose enough, the car would power lights but starve ignition. When the immobilizer sensed irregular voltage, it would sulk in silence. When a crowd needed proof that money was still the loudest voice in the room, a poor man would become the prop. He breathed in, slow and steady until his heart matched the pace of the breath. He told himself a truth he had told himself many times. The machine is not the enemy. The myth is. He moved around to the rear where heat from the paving rose in a wavering line. He listened for the buzz of a fuel pump that never woke. He closed his eyes and mapped the circuit. Battery, relay, fuse, ECU, immobilizer. He imagined a finger, careless, cocky, pausing at each point like a tourist taking photos in a museum of power. He almost smiled despite himself. Even sabotage tells the truth. It tells you what someone believes about control. He returned to the fuse panel. Security braced. He ignored them. He slid the pin again, lifted the face, and this time he let his fingers hover over that one proud fuse. He did not push. He tilted it fractionally to feel whether it had been wedged and by what. The lip moved against something thin. The same detailing spray that made the car look perfect had been used to slick a sliver of plastic that kept the fuse from seating. Sloppy arrogance. Showmanship over substance. He let the panel fall closed again, and for the first time, he allowed himself to look directly at the owner. He did not glare. He studied him the way he studied machines. The man's smile was wide but did not reach the eyes. The eyes held an old hunger, the kind that feeds on witnesses. Samuel turned away. The story wasn't there. He needed one more thing, certainty. He stepped to the passenger side and peered through the glass. The steering column wore a clamshell of leather, but there, a small LED flickered blue and then dark in a rhythm that did not match the factory pattern. An aftermarket layer had been added, then set to fail. It was enough. The car could run. The crowd could be taught. But teaching this crowd meant enduring what came before learning. A storm. The storm arrived in the form of a hotel employee who offered a set of branded gloves and a microfiber cloth. The gesture neat and calculated. It was not kindness. It was containment. Samuel accepted the gloves anyway. He had learned to use even bad faith to do good work. He set the rag aside, pulled on the gloves, and opened the engine bay. Warm air rose with a clean, expensive scent. He checked clamps and visible grounds with a quick, practiced touch. Nothing there. He closed the bay and circled back to the fuse panel. He lifted it yet again, and this time he pressed the fuse in with the barest pressure. No more than a breath. He would not give them the satisfaction of a theatrical push. Nothing happened. Not yet. That was expected. He went to the driver's door and looked at the sill. The door plate bore a sticker with a service date. 2 weeks old! He followed the implication, a software update perhaps. If the update had failed, a system would need a full cycle. Disconnection, reset, relearn. He couldn't do that without tools the hotel would not let him touch. He needed another path. He searched the lines for the old trick, the manual cutoff used by transport companies. On some cars, a hidden switch lived near the battery. On others, a jump post under the hood worked like a key. He traced the panel seams with his fingertips until he found a fastener that turned with less resistance than its brothers. He turned it. The panel eased back. A manual disconnect revealed itself like a secret too proud to stay hidden. He toggled it off. He waited 10 seconds. He toggled it on. The dash woke and died. Progress, but no victory. He felt the crowd's attention wobble. People addicted to spectacle are quick to tire. He could almost hear the boredom learning to become contempt. He had very little time before attention turned to anger. He needed one clean chain of actions. He closed his eyes and built it, step by step, like a schematic drawn on air. Push the fuse fully home. Hard reset the immobilizer. Prime the fuel system by cycling power without cranking. Allow the computer to handshake with sensors. Then ask softly, for life. He opened his eyes and looked at the hotel manager. The man stood with his hands clasped, polite mask fixed. Samuel nodded once and asked without words. The manager stared back, unreadable, then gave the smallest motion to a valet. The valet slid a key fob onto the sill and stepped away like a man placing an object at a shrine. It was enough. Samuel did the steps in order. He seated the fuse with a final, precise touch. He toggled the cutoff. He waited. He pressed the fob to the column where the coil could drink its signal. He did not crank. He let the systems wake and argue and settle. The dash pulsed. The immobilizer LED flickered in the correct rhythm for the first time. He cycled the power again. The car inhaled, slow and deep. The crowd leaned forward as one, a single creature hungry for sound. He placed his palm on the fender, not for balance, but as a promise to himself. Whatever happened next, it would be done with care. He reached in and tapped the start. Silence. A sharper silence than before, the kind that breaks into a crowd like a slap. The line between curiosity and contempt disappeared. Phones held steady, but the mood shifted. He felt it land on his shoulders. The owner's grin widened. Security took a step closer, as if the failure itself gave them warrant to end the scene. Samuel did not move. He listened. Beneath the silence, he heard a cough. Digital, not mechanical. A handshake that failed at the last exchange. He did the math. One more thing hid in this car. Something small and smug. He stepped back and looked at the wheel well. A tiny wire harness tucked near the liner had been disturbed. The clip showed a light scratch. He crouched and traced it to a sensor. Wheel speed. The car's brain would not allow ignition if it believed it was in motion during a start sequence. Someone had told the car a lie. He needed a single tool he did not have. He improvised. He pulled the nickel from his pocket and bent the safety pin through it to make a short, stiff bridge. He slid this makeshift wand into the clip and reseated it until the pin clicked and held. He stood, feeling the crunch of grit under his knees, and smoothed the glove over his palm as if wiping dust from a memory he didn't want to carry anymore. He tapped start again. A low whir. The fuel pump woke like a small animal. The dash lit and stayed. The immobilizer light went steady, then dark. The engine turned once, twice, searching for a promise it could believe. A cough, a stumble, then stillness. The crowd roared with delight, not because they enjoyed the mechanics of failure, but because failure had a face that confirmed what they believed. He could see it in their posture, in their relief. In the way, triumph rested easiest on those who hadn't risked anything. He felt the old well of anger rise, hot and clear, but he did not drink from it. He let it burn down to something steadier. He thought of the first time a teacher handed him a textbook with missing pages and told him to learn anyway. He thought of the first job application that vanished after the interview when they saw the name and the man who carried it. He thought of the last machine he fixed for an employer who later told a client the work had been done by someone else, someone with a handshake that looked a certain way. He thought of all of it, and he placed it gently on the ground beside him and chose the machine again. He cycled the power once more. He waited. He placed the fob in the exact spot where the antenna sat inside the column. He pressed his thumb lightly against the start. The engine turned. It searched. It almost found itself. Then it stopped. He had reached the border between sabotage and software. He could go no further without the right interface. He could accept defeat and leave the crowd with their story. He could also try one last path he had learned in another life. A path that wasn't in the manual, but lived in the quiet corners of engineers who speak to one another in favors and notes scribbled on napkins. He knew a reset sequence built into some high-performance systems, a rhythm of power cycles and pedal presses that told the brain to rebuild assumptions. It wasn't guaranteed. It had risks. It also had dignity. He looked at the owner only once. More. Not for permission, not for validation, but to see whether the man wanted truth or theater. The answer glared back in mirror-polished shoes. Theater. Always theater. So Samuel gave the car truth. He performed the sequence with slow precision. Power on. Wait. Power off. Wait. Pedal held to a measured count. Key near coil. Power on again. Release. The dash ran its test, and for the first time displayed a message he had hoped to see. A quiet icon that meant the system had stopped panicking and started listening. He reached for the start and hesitated. A memory hit him like cold water. The night he lost his last engineering job because a client refused to let him touch a prototype after hours, then approved the same request from a junior white colleague who copied Samuel's notes and took the credit. He remembered standing alone in the parking lot, listening to the hum of lights and the throb of anger in his ears, deciding that he would never again ask permission to be competent. He took his hand away from the start button and held it in the air for a breath, letting the memory pass through him. Then he pressed. The engine caught. It didn't roar. It hummed, surprised at its own success, then settled into a soft, predatory purr. The sound cut through the courtyard like a clean blade. The crowd froze as if a spell had been broken. For one sharp second, there was only the music of combustion done right. It was beautiful. It was simple. It was undeniable. Then everything complicated again. The owner moved first, stepping in with rehearsed triumph, as if the outcome had always been his to claim. Security closed like walls. The hotel manager's smile snapped into place like a polished mask. The crowd needed a new story now, and they were quick to write it. A lucky guess, a fluke, a coincidence. Phones stopped recording. Some hands lowered, others stayed up, catching only the end, ready to share a version without context. Samuel felt the old danger return, the danger of being erased in real time. He stood still as the engine idled. He weighed his options. He could walk away in quiet victory and let the moment dissolve. He could demand acknowledgement and invite the backlash he knew would follow. He could insist on fairness in a place built to resist it. He could also choose something stranger and harder. He turned and faced the hotel facade, not the crowd. He listened to the engine's rhythm. He heard a faint tick that didn't belong, a lifter announcing that the oil had sat too long in the wrong places. He heard a misalignment so slight that it would take a long highway run to shake out. He heard potential abuse from a man who liked to make scenes. He understood the car's future if it stayed in the same hands that had used it as a weapon for humiliation. His thoughts were interrupted by movement at the edge of the crowd. Two uniformed officers stepped into the courtyard. Their presence carried a familiar chill. The security team pointed, not at the owner, not at the tampered panel, but at the man in worn clothes with the gloves on his hands. Samuel understood. This was the next act. It always was. The engine idled. The night pressed close. The nearest officer scanned the scene, taking in only the simplest version. An expensive car, a wealthy host, an older black man standing at the center. The officer's hand hovered near a belt he didn't need to touch. The air grew thick with a danger that had nothing to do with engines. The crowd sensed it too and circled tighter, hungry for a different kind of spectacle. Some faces softened with uncertainty, others sharpened with excitement. It was the wrong energy in the wrong place, and Samuel could feel how quickly it could spiral. He had steadied machines at the edge of failure. Now he steadied himself. He removed the gloves. He placed them carefully. On the fender, palms up, an offering that also said, "I have nothing to hide." He stepped back from the car so the engine sound, not his presence, would fill the space. He kept his hands visible and his expression calm, not to appease anyone but to secure a perimeter around his own dignity. The officer's eyes flicked to his hands, then to the car, then to the owner. The owner raised his chin with a practiced blend of innocence and entitlement. Samuel watched the officers take their cues, the way systems do when the strongest signal isn't truth but confidence. A memory returned with brutal clarity. The day a project he led was audited. The same calm hands, the same polite mask, the same assumptions that the most qualified person in the room could not be the black one. He remembered how that day ended, with his name missing from the report and someone else's name in bold. He swallowed the taste of that day and refused to let it flavor this one. The engine purred. The dashboard glowed. The crowd waited to see who the night would choose. Samuel held his ground, not defiant, simply present. He had learned that presence itself was resistance in places that wanted him to vanish. He watched the officer take a step toward him and prepare a question that would not be a question at all. He braced for it. He prepared to explain without pleading. He prepared to be interrupted and to keep his voice even. He prepared, in short, to live inside the ritual that demanded he justify his right to touch what he had just repaired. And then, something shifted, not in the crowd, not in the officers, but inside the machine. The idol dipped, wavered, and steadied again. A warning light flirted with the edge of visibility. The engine was not fully healed. The sabotage had left residue. The system needed one more correction, a relearned drive, a calibration under motion, a final handshake with road and air. Only one person present knew that. Samuel did the small thing that would matter later. He reached into the cabin and turned off the engine himself, preventing anyone from claiming the last act. The sudden quiet fell heavy. The officers paused at the change in scene. The owner looked annoyed at losing the sound that made him feel powerful. The crowd deflated as if a song had ended mid-chorus. Into that quiet, Samuel laid down a simple truth, not with words, but with steps. He walked to the rear, closed the fuse panel correctly, wiped the last smudge from the seam, and then stood aside, empty-handed. He had given them a car that worked. He had also left them a question they didn't yet know how to answer, because the machine would start again. It would drive, but only if someone understood what had been done to it and why, and only if someone was willing to admit it. He watched the owner move as if to reclaim the story. He watched security nod as if to confirm the order of things. He watched the officers relax by a degree as the tension bled into etiquette. Samuel felt the moment slipping, not his victory, but the meaning of it. He had been here before, and he knew how stories like this were rewritten before they were even told. He took a breath and made the one choice the script did not expect. He did not leave. He stayed still in the center of the courtyard, not blocking, not arguing, simply present with the knowledge of what came next for that car and for the people around it. He knew that if he walked away now, the night would turn his skill into a rumor and his dignity into a prop. If he stayed, the night would have to choose what to do with a truth that wouldn't move. The owner slid into the driver's seat with a flourish meant for cameras. The engine fired once more, obedient now, smoothed by the reset. The crowd cheered like the end of a show. The officers stepped back, their interest drifting toward the next call. The hotel staff began to reposition ropes and stanchions to restore the shape of the event. Then the engine coughed, soft but audible. The cheer faltered. The owner revved the throttle too quickly, more for drama than for function, and the system hesitated. The warning light returned, faint but real. Samuel watched without expression. He knew what the car needed: a careful drive, a measured sequence, patience. He knew the owner would give it none of that, and the night, hungry for spectacle, leaned forward again. The tires chirped against the stone as the car lurched, settled, and lurched once more. The owner's face tightened. The crowd's joy thinned. The engine's voice changed, asking for mercy in a language only a mechanic or an engineer who still loved machines would hear. Samuel's hands twitched at his sides, wanting to fix, wanting to help. He kept them still. He had already given enough. The car shuddered and died. Silence fell, harder this time, leaking embarrassment into expensive shoes. The crowd turned like weather, seeking the next explanation. Some eyes drifted back to Samuel, already building a new story that would save their pride. Sabotage in reverse, a trick the poor man must have played. He felt the accusation forming like a storm front. He had seconds before it broke. He stepped forward into the space between the car and the crowd, into the small no-man's land where truth sometimes stands. He did not speak. He let the facts arrange themselves: clean seams, corrected fuses, a settled immobilizer, an engine that ran when treated with respect and failed when whipped for the camera. He stood there as a living arrow pointing at cause and effect. He stood there and held the line. Phones rose again. The owner scowled at the dashboard as if anger could rewrite code. The officers watched, unsure whether this was theater or trouble. The manager smiled his thin smile and looked for exits that would keep donors content. The night felt fragile, ready to tilt toward ugliness or understanding, and Samuel knew which way crowds usually chose. Then came the moment that would decide it. A guest near the front, a woman in a red dress, looked from the car to Samuel and back again. Her expression shifted not to pity but to thought. She whispered to the man beside her, and for the first time that night, a pair of eyes in that crowd saw what had actually happened. One pair was not enough to change the weather, but it was enough to plant doubt in the wind. Samuel held the silence as if it were a tool. He waited. He allowed the owner to try again and fail again. He allowed the crowd to hear their own laughter collapse under the weight of a machine that refused to be part of a lie. He allowed the officers to see that the only force in danger here was pride. He had no control over what they would choose next. He had only control over what he would endure. And as the engine died a second time, the night made its decision. One that would drag Samuel into a new circle of risk he had sensed from the beginning. The owner stepped out of the car, not embarrassed but furious. The kind of fury that seeks a target it can wound without consequence. Security shifted toward Samuel as if pulled by a tide. The crowd leaned in with a single hungry breath. The storm he had predicted finally broke, and what happened in the next minutes? The hands that reached, the words that cut without needing to be spoken, the line between humiliation and harm that, thinned by the second, would prove that this night had never really been about a car at all. It had always been about who was allowed to hold the keys. The courtyard exploded with noise, shouting, footsteps, the metallic hum of tension snapping loose. The millionaire's laughter had vanished, replaced by something sharper, rage disguised as control. Security moved in, their polished shoes scraping against the stone as the crowd pulled back, eager to watch but not to help. The red Ferrari sat behind them, silent again, its reflection warping the faces of those who wanted someone to blame, and all eyes turned to Samuel. He didn't move. His pulse hammered, but his face stayed calm, the calm of someone who had lived too long in the crosshairs of suspicion. One of the guards barked an order he didn't hear clearly, but the meaning was obvious. Step back. Hands up, don't resist. He had seen that stance before. The chest pushed forward, the jaw locked, not to protect, but to dominate. He'd seen it in workshops, on streets, in meetings where his ideas had been stolen and renamed. It was the same performance, just in a sharper suit. The millionaire raised his voice. He touched my car. Now it's dead again. You saw him. He broke it. It was enough. The accusation stuck in the air like a weapon. Two guards stepped closer. One reached for Samuel's wrist, but he didn't flinch. He simply looked at them, and for a heartbeat, something in that look made even the guard hesitate. Maybe it was the quiet steadiness of a man who had stopped fearing humiliation a long time ago. Maybe it was something deeper, the faint realization that the story being told didn't quite add up. The owner's voice rose again, louder, shaking with the need to stay in control. Do your job. Get him away from my car! Samuel exhaled slowly. The night air tasted of exhaust, champagne, and hypocrisy. He wanted to speak, to tell them the truth, that the car had been tampered with long before he touched it. But he knew how this scene played out. In places like this, truth didn't matter. Perception did. And perception had already been purchased. The guards grabbed his arms. The crowd murmured, phones lifted higher. Some smiled. Others looked away, ashamed of their own silence. The weight of every injustice he'd endured pressed down on him at once. Every door closed before it opened. Every nod that wasn't respect but tolerance. Every moment he'd been expected to apologize just for existing in someone else's comfort zone. He tried to breathe evenly, but his throat burned. The humiliation wasn't new, it was just louder this time. Then, suddenly, the Ferrari roared to life. The sound ripped through the courtyard like thunder. The guards froze. Heads turned. The car's engine, once silent and mocking, now purred with flawless rhythm, steady and strong. The crowd gasped. Samuel stared, chest rising. He hadn't touched the car since the last reset. He hadn't needed to. The car had needed time to relearn itself, to trust its own system again. All it had required was patience and understanding, something the owner didn't possess. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. The millionaire's smirk faltered. His confusion twisted into panic. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He was supposed to be right. He was supposed to win. But the truth had started the engine. Samuel looked at him. Just one glance, heavy with years of unspoken truth. The owner turned pale, then angry again, deflecting the only way he knew how. He must have rigged it. "He's trying to embarrass me," the crowd murmured. Doubt spread through them like wildfire. Someone whispered, "He fixed it." We all saw it. Someone else said, "No, he didn't even touch it this time." It was the first time the crowd spoke for him, not against him. But the moment didn't last. The millionaire, desperate to reclaim his control, stepped forward and shoved Samuel hard in the chest. The motion was sudden, violent, and cruel. Samuel stumbled backward, hitting the side of the car. His rag fell to the ground. A collective gasp filled the air. The shove wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It was every time the world had tried to push him out of a place he had earned. Every time skill and dignity had meant less than skin and status. Samuel steadied himself, eyes locked on the man in front of him. He could feel the crowd's gaze burn into him, waiting for him to retaliate, to confirm their fears, to become the stereotype they'd built for men like him. But he didn't. He straightened his jacket, picked up his rag, and stood tall. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, but it cut through the chaos like steel through glass. You can't break something that was already broken. For a second, no one understood. Then the weight of it sank in. Not about the car, but about the man who owned it. The millionaire stepped back, caught off guard. The guards froze, unsure of whose side they were on anymore. Even the crowd, drunk on spectacle, began to feel something heavier than entertainment. Shame. Samuel turned away, walking toward the edge of the courtyard. The Ferrari's engine still hummed, proof of his silent triumph. But before he could leave, flashing red and blue lights painted the walls. Police. Someone had called them. The laughter was gone now, replaced by whispers. The narrative had changed again. An officer stepped out, hand near his holster, scanning the scene. "What's going on here?" The owner seized his chance. "That man, he tampered with my car? Look at him! He doesn't belong here!" Samuel stopped. The words hit harder than the shove. He doesn't belong here. He had heard them in 100 different forms, in interviews, in stares, in policies that didn't need to say what they meant. They were the words that built invisible walls, the kind you crash into long before you see them. The officer's gaze landed on him. For a moment, Samuel's heart skipped. He saw the shift in stance, the narrowing of eyes, the hand hovering over authority. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, the gesture of a man who knew what misunderstanding could cost. The crowd went silent, phones recording every second. One wrong move, one wrong breath, and the story could end here, in the way so many others had before. The officer stepped closer, hand resting on the gun. "Sir, step away from the vehicle." Samuel obeyed, his movements slow, deliberate. He spoke softly, his voice steady. "I didn't touch it." The car fixed itself. You can ask them. The officer didn't look at the crowd. He kept his focus on Samuel, as if the truth could only come from one direction. The tension was unbearable, thick, electric, fragile. Then from behind the crowd, the woman in the red dress stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but it carried weight. He didn't do anything wrong. We all saw it. The car was broken, and he helped. He didn't hurt it. Her courage cracked something open. Others began to nod, hesitant at first, then stronger. He fixed it. He didn't break a thing. He saved that car. The officer hesitated. For the first time, the crowd's voice overpowered the millionaire's money. The truth was louder than fear. Samuel stood still, eyes on the officer, waiting to see which world would win, the one that judged or the one that finally listened. After a long silence, the officer lowered his hand. "Sir, you're free to go." The crowd exhaled as if the air had been held for too long. The millionaire stood speechless, face drained of color. The engine of his Ferrari idled beside him, a machine that had chosen the one man he'd tried to humiliate. Samuel nodded once, quietly, and began to walk away. His steps were slow, but there was power in them, the kind of power that comes from surviving every attempt to erase you. Behind him, the crowd murmured. The millionaire shouted something, but no one listened anymore. The story had changed hands. As Samuel reached the edge of the courtyard, he paused. He looked back, not at the car, not at the man, but at the reflection of the lights dancing on the red paint. He saw himself in that reflection, not as they had seen him, but as he truly was, a builder, a teacher, a man whose worth had never depended on anyone's permission. He smiled faintly, then turned the corner and disappeared into the quiet streets. Behind him, the Ferrari idled for a few seconds more, then sputtered, coughed, and went silent again. The crowd gasped. The owner cursed, and the camera phones stopped recording. Because deep down, everyone understood. The car had worked for the man who respected it, and died for the one who didn't. The night had revealed more than a broken engine. It had revealed a truth no one could unsee, and somewhere in the distance, walking beneath the city lights, Samuel carried that truth with him. Silent, steady, and unbroken, but the world had only just begun to notice him. He walked home that night with the city still humming, but the sound felt different. It was as if the streets were speaking in two voices, one that had always said he didn't belong, and the other, quieter, that had finally begun to admit it had been wrong. His feet ached. His hands smelled faintly of metal and oil, the old perfume of a life spent fixing what others had already given up on. Under the street lamps, his shadow stretched ahead of him, long and steady, and for the first time in a long time, he felt it had weight. Not the weight of fear or shame, but the weight of truth. He slept only for a few hours. The morning came in pale light, spilling across the cracked sink and the small table where he kept a chipped cup and a notebook filled with diagrams that no one had asked him to draw. He sat there with his coffee and wrote a few lines he would not show anyone. He wrote about engines that learn and unlearn, about patience that isn't weakness, about how dignity survives even when the crowd demands a show. He wrote about the car, yes, but really he wrote about people, how some of them run better when handled gently, how some of them stall because they have learned to fear the hands that reach for them. By noon, the city had already turned the night into content. Clips appeared in jagged timelines. Quiet hands, a red car, a crowd that loved the first failure and did not know what to do with the second. Some videos cut out the part where the engine came to life. Others stayed long enough to show it, then ended before the car died again. A few, only a few, held the whole arc without interruption, as if the person recording had understood that truth needed time to breathe. Comment sections bloomed with certainty and denial, the old flowers that grow wherever ego is watered. Strangers argued about him while knowing nothing about him, a chorus of voices trying to decide whether his life could mean anything at all. He did not watch most of it. He had learned long ago that the world will feed you the versions of yourself that keep its appetite full. He spent the morning doing what he always did, fixing small things that still mattered when nobody was looking. a leaky faucet in a neighbor's kitchen, a loose hinge at the corner store. The kind of problems that do not trend, that do not become headlines, that never make a crowd gasp, only make a life easier. But the night had not been a private thing, and it did not stay contained. By afternoon, a knock came at his door. Not the kind that demanded, but the kind that asked. A reporter stood there, careful, rehearsed, smiling the way people smile when they hope not to make a wound worse. Others followed on other days. Curious voices, careful pens, cameras that promised sensitivity. He allowed a few minutes to one, then to another, and only because he sensed something honest behind their questions, not a hunt for scandal, but a reach for understanding. He answered in simple sentences. He did not argue or accuse. He named what he had seen. He named what had been done to the car. He named what had been done to him long before the night and long after it. He did not offer rage to be packaged. He offered the kind of quiet that forces people to hear their own noise. The man with the car vanished back into safety at first, then returned on a different stage with a different tone. He offered the city a rework of the story. Miscommunication, misunderstanding, unfortunate optics. He praised law and order, charity and good intentions. He spoke of complications no one could verify. He insisted on respect for property, as if property had been the only thing at stake. Sponsors nodded. Doors stayed open where they had always stayed open for him. He wore the same smile like armor, and it protected him again because the world had been built to protect him. Still, something was different. Not enough, not yet, but different. People who had stood silent at the edge of the courtyard wrote to him without asking for a reply. Some admitted they had laughed. Some confessed they had recorded. Some told him that shame kept them awake later, that his stillness had exposed their noise, that the engine's brief music had stabbed through the scaffolding of their certainty. A few asked how they could help. Most simply said they now saw what they had not wanted to see. Apologies are easy when they are sent into the air without cost. He received them without ceremony. He did not forgive a system through the mouths of individuals, but he made room for individuals to step out from behind a system. Even that was a kind of repair. The police department released a small statement that said nothing decisive. The hotel issued a larger statement that said everything and nothing at once. The words were the ones institutions keep on a shelf for nights like this. Regret for any distress caused, commitment to inclusion, a promise to review procedures. The review would be quiet, he knew. The promise would be loud until it wasn't. He had lived long enough to feel which words were made of air and which were made of action. None of that changed the place where the story mattered most, inside him. The night had pressed on old scars until they hummed with heat, and the morning had cooled them without erasing them. He walked the city with a different posture now, not taller but steadier. He moved through spaces that had once demanded that he shrink, and he allowed himself the miracle of not shrinking. It was not victory. It was survival with a shape. People who had known him for years began to look at him differently, as if the city had placed a new frame around his face. Some said they were proud of him, as if pride could be loaned like a suit for a special occasion. Some said the video had made them cry. He nodded and thanked them and returned to work. He reminded himself not to measure his worth by these waves of attention. He had learned that a life cannot be built on the weather. It must be built on the ground you choose to stand on when the weather changes. There were hard moments that did not trend. A mechanic who had once let him use a lift after hours told him the shop was too busy now. A client stopped returning calls. A friend warned him that visibility attracts both light and knives. He accepted this without becoming bitter. He had learned to carry two truths at once, that change is possible and that it resists being born. One night, a message arrived that did not look like the others. It was from a young student who had watched one of the longer videos, the kind that didn't cut away. The student wrote about the first time a teacher assumed they were in the wrong classroom, about the first time a neighbor locked a car door at the sight of them, about the first time they watched someone less skilled be trusted more. The student had wanted to quit the program they loved. Then they watched an older man stand in a courtyard and choose dignity over performance, patience over panic, presence over disappearance. They wrote that they'd decided not to quit. They signed with a first name and nothing else. He read the message twice, then again, then once more, and he folded it into the notebook where he kept his diagrams. This, he thought, is how engines pass on their heat, one small transfer at a time. Days bled into weeks. The story didn't disappear, but it moved to the edges of the city's attention, where true things often live. He kept working. He replaced a breaker in a laundromat and watched a row of machines wake up like sleepy animals. He unjammed a roller door, so an elderly neighbor could get her cart through to the sidewalk without bruising her knuckles. He taught a boy how to hold a screwdriver like a pencil, not a knife, and the boy's face lit in a way that made the day smaller and bigger at once. He realized that the night at the hotel had not been the proof of his worth. It had only been a broadcast. The worth had been there in all these small repairs, in a life made of uncelebrated fixes. People asked him sometimes whether he regretted not taking the car. He smiled at the idea that a prize could fix a wound. He thought about what that car had represented for the man who used it like a weapon and what it had represented for the crowd that treated it like an altar. He thought about how a machine becomes a mirror for the person who holds its keys. He knew what prize he had taken instead. It did not have doors or paint or a name. It was the right to define himself in a world that likes to do that work for you, and yet the night had demanded more than a quiet personal lesson. It had exposed a pattern large enough to see from far away if anyone in power cared to look. The pattern did not begin with a red car or end with a lucky video angle. It had been stitched, thread by thread, into policies that maintain appearances and punish truth, into workplaces where credit travels the path of least resistance, into neighborhoods where suspicion is the first language, into schools where brilliance must audition for trust, into a justice system that plays with weighted dice and calls it order, into the daily theater where humility is demanded from the same mouths that worship entitlement. The pattern weaponizes doubt. It says that a black man's calm is arrogance and a white man's arrogance is confidence. It says competence must be proved again and again until the proving itself becomes a prison. It says a scene is more valuable than a solution, and that the solution itself does not count unless the right person is seen delivering it. It says property deserves protection and dignity can wait. It says the narrative belongs to whoever paid for the lighting, but the pattern is not invincible. He had seen it falter when one person in a red dress decided to step forward instead of shrinking back. He had seen it stutter when a crowd, trained to clap for power, found itself listening to a different rhythm for half a minute. He had felt it hesitate when an officer's hand, resting heavy near a holster, finally learned to rest lighter because the air itself refused to hold a lie any longer. Even machines built to enforce a certain order can misfire when truth enters the circuit. Even systems can be rewired slowly, stubbornly, with the patient work of hands that remember the blueprint of justice. He knew what kind of work that would be. It would be unglamorous. It would be repetitive. It would be fought in meeting rooms and hiring committees and classrooms and living rooms and streets with no cameras. It would involve people with power choosing to surrender some of it, not as charity, but as repair. It would involve people without power deciding, when safe to do so, to claim space they have been told to give up. It would mean teaching children different reflexes, so a new generation reaches for understanding before reaching for a story that keeps them comfortable. It would mean asking a harder kind of question whenever the crowd gathers and the first laugh arrives. What am I applauding, and whom is my applause erasing? He did not imagine himself as the hero of this work. He could not survive that kind of myth. He imagined himself instead as a node in a network, one connection among many. He imagined the student who had decided not to quit becoming an engineer who would design systems that welcomed more hands. He imagined the woman in red telling the truth in rooms where truth had gone missing. He imagined the officer practicing a different kind of attention the next time the air rippled with danger. He imagined the hotel manager learning to recognize the sound of a story that protects donors and harms dignity, and choosing differently. He imagined the man with the car looking into a mirror he had avoided for years and finally seeing not a winner, but a person who had been trained to think winning was everything. He did not wish humiliation on him. He wished him a conscience deep enough to change. A week after the night, the hotel sent a formal invite to a listening session. It was staged, curated, fragile, but he went anyway. He sat in a circle with people who used words like optics and accountability and best practice, and he listened. When it was his turn, he chose the same simple language he had used all his life with machines. He asked them to stop treating equality like an accessory. He asked them to replace scripts with habits. He asked them to update not their statements, but their instincts. He did not leave triumphant. He left as he had arrived, patient, alert to the small clicks that signal a circuit has accepted a new connection. He used his notebook differently after that. The diagrams grew next to lists of names, of young people he could teach on Saturdays, of shop owners who would lend space for classes, of elders who could tell stories at the back of a community center where the floor creaked in warm, familiar ways. He called these pages his new blueprints, not for engines, but for attention. He believed attention could be engineered, retrained to notice what matters, to reward care, to believe skill when it sees it in unexpected hands. He did not pretend the work would save him from future harm. He did not pretend a single night had fixed anything widely. He accepted that the pattern would resist, that there would be tired days, cruel days, days when nothing would move. He promised himself he would rest without quitting. He promised himself he would let joy enter the workshop, a joy made of simple victories, an appliance that hums after a long silence, a child's scribbled thank you note, the way a corridor sounds when people pass through it without needing to look over their shoulders. Months later, he passed the Grand Imperial again. The courtyard had returned to its reflective calm. No cameras, no crowd, no theater. He paused where he had stood that night and listened, not for an engine, but for the echo of his own heart. It beat the way good machines run after a careful tune, steady without strain. He understood something then that he had not been able to say out loud, that the most important repair of the night had not been under a hood. It had been inside a life. He had learned to stand inside a storm and not perform for it. He had learned to refuse the lie that dignity must ask permission. He turned to go, and for a second, he saw his reflection again in the marble, an older man with clear eyes and hands that knew their work. The image faded as he moved, but the knowledge stayed. He belonged everywhere his skill and humanity could be of use. He would not wait for an invitation to be real. What remains after the crowd disperses is what always remained. The choice each of us makes about the stories we believe and the stories we build. Will we keep rewarding the loudest angle, the shiniest scene, the version that protects comfort and punishes truth? Or will we practice a different kind of attention, the kind that watches all the way through, that holds judgment while listening, that intervenes when harm begins, that acknowledges skill without rerouting credit to the nearest safe face? Maybe the question is simpler. When the engine of injustice coughs and stalls, who among us will place a steady hand on the fender and wait with it, refusing to be rushed into a lie? He never received the keys to that car. He did not need them. He found something heavier and more useful than horsepower, a city that could no longer pretend it hadn't seen what it had seen. Not everyone changed. Not enough changed. But some did. And change, like a well-tuned engine, rarely begins with a roar. It begins with a hum so gentle you almost miss it, until the road opens and the hum becomes movement. If you watched his story and felt your chest tighten at the shove, if you felt heat in your throat when hands reached for the wrong man, if you felt relief when the engine sang and then dread when it went quiet again, let that feeling do work. Talk to someone who would have laughed with the crowd. Speak up the next time a room begins to tilt. Share the whole story, not just the part that feels neat. Support the hands that fix without applause. Hire the person whose skill scares your bias. Teach the child near you to look for dignity first. Because engines remember how they are treated. So do people. So do cities. He kept walking, and the city breathed, and somewhere a young student opened a textbook and stayed. Somewhere a mechanic tightened a clip and chose honesty over spectacle. Somewhere a manager replaced a policy written to please donors with a habit meant to protect dignity. Somewhere a crowd gathered and someone in a red dress spoke before the silence hardened. The night at the hotel did not end a pattern. It traced it in light so those who wanted to break it could see where to begin. And now it's your turn to choose a tool. Will you help recalibrate what we reward, what we record, what we believe when a scene begins? Will you move beyond watching to acting, beyond sharing to showing up, beyond apology to repair? If the engine of justice is stalling, is your foot still on the throttle of comfort, or are your hands ready to steady the frame and do the work?